For being one of the most renowned people in history and perhaps the single most important figure for the English language, we seem to know very little about William Shakespeare outside of his plays and poetry. Most ideas we have about Shakespeare are merely educated guesses. I'm sure you have an image of Shakespeare in your mind, and it's even the one I'm using right now, but we aren't even too sure if that is actually a portrait of him. Perhaps the most famous image of Shakespeare comes from the image on the front cover of the original edition of the First Folio, believed to be by Martin Droeshout, who was only 15 when Shakespeare died, so it's unlikely he met the bard himself, with this drawing supposedly based on another portrait that is too supposedly Shakespeare. We know very little about his private life too. It's been heavily speculated that he hated his wife, but this is primarily built on a lack of evidence. We have no written letters between Shakespeare and his wife Anne Hathaway, with just as little evidence that he hated his wife as we do to support him loving his wife. The biggest argument for him hating his wife comes from his will, leaving her his second best bed. Now this might sound like a slight dig, but it's also believed that the second best bed was their bed, with the best bed being reserved for guests. It's just one of those things we don't really know. There's even contention in his plays. We aren't too sure of the exact timeline they were written in, and of course there are the fabled lost plays, and of course we have very little of his actual handwriting left. What we do have left of his handwriting, which is handy for us, are 6 signatures from legal documents. This is handy for us as with signatures comes names, and that's where one of the most interesting things about the mystery of Shakespeare comes into play. As for all 6 of the signatures, Shakespeare never spelled his surname the same way twice. The ways he wrote his surname include, and I'm taking some creative liberties with the pronunciations, Shakespeare, 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 and Shakespeare, with those last 3 all coming from his will, 3 different spellings in one document. Some even argue that these can be spelt differently too, and the seriously interesting thing about all this is that out of the 6 spellings we have, none of them are spelt the way we spell Shakespeare today. So why on earth did Shakespeare write his name differently, and how did we end up with the spelling we have today? To understand this, we need to have a wider look at Elizabethan English and how the Elizabethans used language. The version of English used by Shakespeare and the Elizabethan English is vastly different to the English we have today. Ask any frustrated student studying Shakespeare. The alphabet only had 24 letters as opposed to the 26 we have today. I and J were used interchangeably, with J being used as the capital of I, as well as U and V being used interchangeably too, with U being used in the middle of words and V being used at the start. And of course, most interestingly, Y didn't make the sound we know it makes today, but instead was used to make the th sound. Hence, when we see something saying ye as in ye old shop, it should still be said as the as we say the today. The Elizabethan times were a hugely volatile time for the English language, with new words being constantly created, with just a little help from our William. While the works of Shakespeare may seem like dull affairs that you have to sit through at school, he did so much for the English language. There's probably a word you've used today that Shakespeare coined. While most of his words weren't coined out of the thin air, he toyed with language in ways no one had before him. Uncomfortable, swagger, manager, cold and hot-blooded. Even eyeball was coined by the bard. And yes, luckily for us, he even created names. The names Miranda, Jessica, and Olivia are all believed to be coined by Shakespeare. So while he could write names he invented properly, he couldn't get a grasp of his own name. Why was this? Well, like I said, during Elizabethan England, the English language was in a very progressive state, words being invented constantly and words changing. The spelling of language hadn't really been formalised yet. People weren't as anal about spelling as they are now. There was no comment section on YouTube videos letting you know when a word was spelt wrong. What a time to be alive. People would spell things freely, how they saw fit at the time, and no one would bat an eye. Well, eyeball I should say. It was due to this that Shakespeare was able to spell his name so many different ways at different times. This was the way things were then, as far as we can tell. Anyway, how did we end up with the spelling of the surname we have today? Well, a lot of it is thanks to one of the first things we mentioned in this video, the all-important First Folio, the first published collection of the works of William Shakespeare. The First Folio was published 7 years after his death, which is believed to be the same day he was born, and yes, even his birthday is up for debate. It was compiled by a close friend of his, Ben Jonson, and what's also interesting about Jonson is that he consistently spelt the name as Shakespeare, so when it came to putting the bard's name on the compendium of his plays, Jonson used the spelling he had always been using, William Shakespeare, and with the folio being the definitive edition of his work, it was the name on the front cover that became the official spelling of the name to this very day. So was Shakespeare actually called Shakespeare? Well, maybe, but also maybe not. It was definitely a name that sounded somewhat similar to Shakespeare as we see from his signatures, but if that was the definitive way he spelt it at the time, we may not know for sure, as evidence from his signatures point to the way that wasn't how he spelt it. But that's fine. Shakespeare was too busy blessing the world with language to be worried about his own name. As the bard said himself, what's in a name? Name Explained depends on awesome people like yourself donating small amounts on a monthly basis, so a massive thank you to everyone on Patreon who does just that. In return for your awesome donations, you get a ton of Name Explained goodies, from weekly Q&As to newsletters to chances to suggest somewhere for the Tuesday video. All of that from $1, and $2 gets you all that plus your name here with all these awesome people. Thank you.